Before the Vikings ever carved fear into Europe's coasts, another power perfected something colder and far older. When Rome won a war, the battlefield ended, but the sentence did not. The men who stood against the eagles were cut down or paraded in chains, but their wives were folded into a machine that didn't need longships or fire. It needed paperwork, oaths, law. Not chaos, procedure, not rage, policy. Rome gave the world roads, aqueducts, and order. It also gave conquest an afterlife. What happened to the wives of Rome's enemies was not an accident of pillage, it was the point of victory. Titles dissolved, names translated or erased, households unthreaded strand by strand, until identity itself felt like contraband. You've heard the legends of northern raiders, but centuries earlier the Roman Republic, and later the Empire, had already written the handbook. Legal, liturgical, lethal to dignity. A system where a woman could survive the sword and still lose everything the sword was meant to protect. Tonight we follow the paper trail Rome left behind, the decrees, rights, marriages of state, mercy policies, and markets that wore laurel wreaths. We'll open doors that history prefers to keep politely closed and ask, when the legions marched away, what did Rome do to the wives of their enemies, and why did it work so chillingly well? Rome conquered more than armies, it conquered households. After the standards were raised and the enemy banners lowered, Rome moved on the one front that never made it into the battle reports, the private lives of the defeated. Wives of enemy leaders, wives of common soldiers, wives of entire tribes, each entered a system that had rules, prices, paperwork, and prayers, not a riot of cruelty, but a choreography of it. First came the legal extinguishing. Under Rome's law of peoples, capture erased status. A wife who had been noble at sunrise could be counted as property by sunset, reclassified from person to thing with a word, captor. Her marriage, suspended by conquest. Her dowry, absorbed into the victor's accounts. Her children, either hostage to keep the tribe obedient or collateral in a new treaty. It wasn't the sword that ended a marriage. Rome claimed the right to end the very memory of it. Then came the sorting, not loot but lots, not spoil but entries. Women were assigned futures with ink. Some sold at coastal markets Rome kept humming like clockwork. Some placed in elite households as showpieces of victory. Others retained as hostages, living treaties whose safety guaranteed the silence of their people. To Rome, a wife could be three things at once: labour, leverage, and lesson. And there was the cruelest Roman invention of all, mercy arranged as policy. A woman could be spared if she served as a bridge, married or concubined into a Roman ally, bound to a new name and a new god. Her survival became Rome's propaganda. Look how generous the conqueror, how orderly the aftermath. Survival, yes, but at the price of identity rewritten in Latin. This is the story we'll tell in stages. First, the laws that made this possible, how capture broke marriages, how guardianship and dowry rules trapped the defeated even after the fighting stopped. Next, the market, why Rome's slave networks could absorb entire populations overnight. Then, the hostages, how wives and daughters stabilized frontiers more effectively than legions. After that, the household, how elite Romans displayed conquered women as living trophies while calling it pietas and order. Finally, the exit doors, manumission, coerced marriages, and the thin pathways by which a few women negotiated fragments of power inside a system meant to take it from them. The Vikings turned suffering into spectacle. Rome turned it into paperwork that never slept. And if you think that made it gentler, you'll need to hear what came next. Rome did not need to shout to unmake a life. It only needed to define it. The moment a city fell or a tribe submitted, the wives of Rome's enemies crossed an invisible border, from person to property, from subject of law to object of it. The term was simple and devastating. Captor. Captured. Under the law of peoples, capture snapped the cords that held a household together. Marriage, once sanctified by rites and witnesses, was treated as suspended by war. A wife could wake as a matron and sleep as merchandise, her legal self reduced to whatever a victor wrote in a ledger. If she had a dowry, its protections dissolved into necessities of war. If she had sons, they could be penned as hostages, if daughters, collateral for a treaty. Rome insisted it was not hatred, it was jurisdiction. Guardianship sealed the change. A freeborn woman in Rome already lived under tutelar, male oversight for major decisions. For the conquered, tutelar hardened into chains without needing iron. A governor, a procurator, a victorious commander, any of them could become guardian by decree, deciding where she lived, whom she served, whether she would be sold, pledged, or placed. The cruelty was that none of this required rage, only signatures. Rome even wrote an escape hatch that mocked the trapped. Post liminium, the legal fiction that if a captive ever returned across the threshold, her old status could revive. But between capture and the miracle of return stood markets, voyages, and men with incentives to keep her from ever seeing that threshold again. Post liminium dangled like a key in a locked room. Titles disappeared neatly. A queen became a private person, a priest's wife, a slave with a new name, a chieftain's widow, a ward of the state. The law called this capitis deminutio, reduction of legal head. To the woman living it, it felt like watching her past be edited in real time. The marriage contract folded and filed as if it had never been signed, the dowry marked absorbed, the children listed not as kin but as guarantees. Then came Rome's favourite theatre, the treaty. After the blood, the words. Deditio in fidem, surrender into good faith. Noble families brought forward their women, not as plaintiffs, but as proof of obedience. The state took wives and daughters for safekeeping, a phrase that sounded like mercy and functioned like a lock. Officials called them obsides, hostages. Rome called this peace. The defeated learned to call it silence. Inside households, law bled into custom. A captive wife reassigned to an elite villa might be labelled a concubina rather than a slave, a veneer of relationship that carried no rights to property, marriage, or name. If she bore children, they belonged to the man who owned her, not to the man she once married. Her past became a rumour. Her future became an asset line. And yet Rome smiled as it did this, pointing to procedure. We have rules, the magistrates could say. We are not barbarians. They were right. This was not barbarism. It was bureaucracy. It left fewer scars you could see, and more that you could not defend against. Rome didn't just win wars, it managed inventory. The wives of defeated men entered a chain that began on the battlefield and ended wherever profit ran highest. The genius and the cruelty was that the system felt ordinary to the people who ran it. First, intake. After surrender, women were catalogued with the same calm tone used for grain. Name if known, origin if useful, age, health, skills. A wooden tablet might carry notes a buyer would want. Weaver, literate, sings, no scars, child at breast. The words looked neutral, the meanings were not. Then, assignment. Not all captives went to the same place. Some were marched to garrison towns where quartermasters could flip a population into pay. Others were moved to port depots, coastal funnels that fed the markets. A governor took his cut, contractors took theirs, and the rest were pushed to auction. At the auctions, the theatre began. A dealer guided the sale with a practiced chant, promising what the buyer wanted to hear. Obedience, fertility, stamina, silence. A placard could list defects under consumer law, illness, escape attempts, unruly temper, because Rome insisted that even the sale of a person should be honest. The law created the appearance of fairness. The stage created the sale. Pricing was a cruel arithmetic. Beauty changed the number. So did proven fertility. So did skills that kept a household running, spinning, weaving, accounting, midwifery. A woman who could read contracts might be bought to manage them, never for herself, always for him. Younger women fetched more, but not always the highest. A reputable healer could sell for more than a frightened girl if a provincial town needed a midwife more than a decoration. Routes were polished, smoothed by repetition. From frontiers like Gaul, Spain, North Africa and the East, caravans moved captives to ports where ships were already waiting. The sea didn't slow the trade, it accelerated it. Across the water, markets near the capital or in booming provinces stood ready to absorb whoever arrived that week. Rome called it commerce. The women called it distance from home with no return. Paperwork followed like a shadow. Bills of sale, tax receipts, transit permits, manumission certificates, kept ready like a carrot Rome could offer later to reward the useful. Each document wrote the new reality deeper into stone. You are not who you were. Even the promise of eventual freedom, if it ever came, would confirm the system's power. Freedom granted is freedom owned first by someone else. Placement completed the transformation. Some women were sent to rural estates, their labour measured in harvests and children. Others were placed in elite townhouses where victory was on display every day at dinner. A few were kept by officials as hostages made household, a living guarantee that a quiet province would stay quiet. The roles had different rooms, different clothing, different forms of address, but the same lock. The market taught its lessons quickly. Speak when spoken to, learn new names for old things, forget the path back in case remembering breaks you. Those who resisted discovered that Rome preferred quiet punishments. Separation from a child, sale to a harsher buyer, a transfer far inland where no one spoke your language. The whip made noise, paper did not. Paper lasted longer. And if a woman tried to calculate a way through, work, obedience, cooperation, the market had already done the math. A best-case outcome was to become valuable to one man in one place, valuable enough that he might one day showcase his mercy by freeing her. Even that mercy would arrive stamped, witnessed and filed. This was the market's greatest victory. It made catastrophe look like procedure. It taught the conqueror to feel ethical while profiting, and it taught the conquered that survival might depend on performing gratitude for the structure that erased them. Rome learned early that fortresses hold borders, but families hold nations. So after the standards were planted and the speeches of surrender were finished, officials asked the question that mattered most. Who will guarantee your obedience? The answer, more often than not, was the wives and daughters of defeated men. They were called obsides, hostages, but the word hides the design. Rome didn't simply seize, it converted. A woman could be moved from her homeland to a governor's residence, a general's entourage, or even to Rome itself, for education, for religion, for safety. Titles that sounded benevolent did the work of a lock. The message to her people was clear: behave, and we will treat her as a guest. Resist, and we will remind you she is not. Ritual began with oaths. Allied kings and tribal leaders swore fidelity to Rome under pain of their household. The pain had terms. If a province missed taxes, stirred rebellion, harboured fugitives, the sanction fell not on abstractions, but on names, on wives whose daily routines became barometers of provincial loyalty. A quiet month meant letters, permitted visits, small courtesies. A rumour of uprising meant doors closed, messages delayed, movements restricted. The empire turned domestic life into an instrument panel. Hostages were not warehoused, they were curated. Rome prided itself on civilizing the elite women it held. Tutors replaced mothers. Latin replaced lullabies. New gods replaced old rites. A change of name sealed the transfer: Greek to Latin, Celtic to Latin, Punic to Latin. It wasn't accidental that the new names often echoed the families who held them, an audible reminder of who now authored this life. Sometimes the conversion was matrimonial. A captive of rank became a bride for peace, placed into the household of a loyal client king or a Roman ally. On paper, it was alliance. In practice, it was a living treaty with a pulse. If her relatives stayed obedient, she shone as a symbol of concord. If they rebelled, her safety vanished into the clause everyone pretended not to notice. Rome didn't need to threaten loudly. It only needed to let the silence after a broken oath do the talking. The education of hostages wasn't incidental, it was policy. A woman raised in the rhythms of Roman ritual began to think in Roman categories, contracts, calendars, chains you couldn't see. Letters home, when allowed, became instruments of governance. Remain loyal, they urged, pay what is due. The handwriting carried the scent of home. The content carried the stamp of Rome. Punishment also had its script. If a frontier erupted, the empire staged consequences with the same composure it brought to law. A favoured hostage disappeared from dinners, then from the city. A privilege was revoked, then a name. In worst cases, the sentence was public, a cautionary tale that travelled faster than legions. Break faith, and we will break the symbol of it. The cruelty was calibrated to be remembered. Not all outcomes were tragedies. Rome understood the power of showcase mercy. A province that kept faith might receive its hostages back garlanded with honours, or see them freed into marriages that preserved face on both sides. Manumission could be performed as theatre, witnesses, documents, gratitude carefully arranged, so that even freedom amplified Rome's benevolence and the story it told about itself. Through all of this ran a quiet arithmetic of leverage. One woman could stabilise a valley, two could still a mountain range. A noble wife placed in a client court could do what a cohort could not: dissolve a brewing revolt at the dinner table, soften a chief's pride, remind a council that their daughter's safety slept under a Roman roof. The empire called it prudence. The women lived it as perpetual contingency. Most devastating was what this system did to memory. At home, her absence became a legend. In Rome, her presence became an exhibit. She was both loved and useful, mourned and managed. If she bore children in her new life, whether as concubine, consort, or legal wife, those children's loyalties braided bloodlines across borders. The next generation would not need chains. They would carry Rome inside their names. Hostages, then, were not a footnote to victory. They were the architecture of it. The Vikings terrorized coasts with raids. Rome pacified continents with relatives. Rome's greatest stage was not the forum, but the front hall. Within its doorposts, the empire rehearsed its story until it felt like truth. Conquered women did not vanish. They were positioned, arranged to make Roman virtue look natural and Roman victory look kind. Mourning began with duty disguised as devotion. A captured noblewoman, now called by a Latin name that fit the tongue of her owner, poured libations at a shrine she did not choose. The household called it piety. She called it rehearsal. Every gesture, head bowed, words repeated, taught visitors that Rome could fold foreign lives into its gods without raising its voice. Work followed with a hierarchy as crisp as a uniform. Skilled women, those who could weave fine cloth, keep accounts, prepare medicines, moved like clockwork pieces that made the domus run. Their competence earned small privileges: better food, a corner of privacy, the chance to keep a trinket that meant something only to them. The lesson was constant: be useful if you wish to be visible. The mistress of the house watched. Some were cruel, some indifferent, some unexpectedly protective. But even kindness carried a price tag. A shawl gifted in winter could be revoked in summer for a perceived slight. A promise of better quarters could dissolve if a rumour reached the wrong ear. Power shifted with the weather, and the weather was someone else's mood. Concubinage gave Rome's theatre its most polished scene. The word sounded softer than slavery and more honest than marriage. In practice, it meant intimacy without rights. A conquered wife, now a concubina, ate better than field labourers, wore finer cloth and lived indoors. She also existed in a permanent twilight. Not a wife who could inherit, not a stranger who could leave. If she bore children, they bore the father's status if he willed it, and her gratitude was expected to be public. The household called this harmony. She knew it as conditional heir. Names were props with sharp edges. A Greek name became Latin, then affectionate diminutive, then a joke when superiors felt safe. Each shift reminded the listener who had the right to rename. Clothing worked the same magic. A simple tunic signalled labour. A dyed stola hinted at favour without ever reaching legality. Jewellery glinted like promises, visible, valuable, and never truly hers. Discipline rarely announced itself with spectacle. Rome preferred punishments that travelled by whisper. A child reassigned to another estate, a skilled woman sold to a harsher buyer inland, a beloved task removed, replaced by one designed to grind the spirit into silence. The household congratulated itself on avoiding the lash. The message was clear: we can disappear you without raising our voices. Yet even in this architecture of control, women engineered survival. They learned accents, tastes, and timetables, who rose early, who drank too much, who loved flattery, who feared scandal. They traded information the way others traded coins, a warning about a tax raid here, a recipe that soothed an ailing child there. Favour was fickle, but sometimes it could be banked. Religion became a second language. Some captives folded Roman prayers into their own, hiding private faith inside public ritual. Others calculated loudly, adopting the household's devotions with an enthusiasm that doubled as armour. Belief mattered less than performance. Safety lived in convincing onlookers that the performance was sincere. There were seasons of apparent warmth. A master manumitted a concubine who bore him heirs. A matron freed a favoured attendant at her own funeral, to burnish her reputation for virtue. Freedom arrived with paperwork and witnesses, then demanded repayment in gratitude. "You are family," benefactors said. The newly freed woman smiled and understood. She would never stop owing the people who once owned her. In death, the theatre wrote its epilogue. Funerary stones for freed women praised their industry and fidelity to the house, sometimes naming the patron more prominently than the deceased. A life summarized as service. A story punctuated by Roman names. The original language of the lost homeland seldom made the inscription. This is how a domus turned conquest into culture, by repeating it at breakfast, by displaying it at dinner, by embalming it in stone. The Vikings needed raids to terrify. Rome needed routines to convince. Rome did not just take people, it rewrote them. The transformation wore the clothing of ceremony, which made it feel inevitable. The first rite was the suspension of marriage. In Roman thinking, war severed bonds the way a blade severs rope. A captured wife's prior union was treated as dormant, neither honoured nor remembered, simply filed away in the drawer marked void by victory. The effect was devastatingly tidy. If she was sold, no adultery could be claimed. If she was taken as a concubine, no lawsuit could be lodged. The word was order. The feeling was erasure. Next came the renaming. A woman's original name, full of family and place, was shortened, Latinized, then reissued like a badge. Names with meanings became sounds that pleased another household's ear. With the new name came a prescribed ancestry. Freedwoman of, or servant of, a lineage that began at the moment Rome recognized her and pretended nothing before that mattered. Religion followed the same script. Public rites required public faces, and a captive's face was enlisted. She learned the gestures at altars not her own, recited vows to gods who had conquered hers. Some believed, some did not. Belief was not the point. Participation was. To refuse was to insult the household and the state at once. To comply was to let Rome write on her soul in a hand everyone could read. There were marriages that looked like rescue and functioned like annexation. A provincial ally would petition to marry a captive noblewoman, the union framed as reconciliation between peoples. The paperwork glowed with benevolence, and the couple's first child became a living treaty article. The woman's consent sat in the margins, elegant and optional. Dowry rules tightened the knot. A dowry was supposed to protect a wife. In conquest, it protected the conqueror. If a woman was remarried under Roman authority, her dowry, and thus her leverage, came from Roman pockets or Roman patrons, which meant it could be recalled, reduced, or used to force obedience. The purse strings were leash and collar. Manumission rituals offered a path that looked like a door. Freed in a magistrate's presence or by a will read aloud, a woman might step into legal personhood again, this time as a freedwoman tied by gratitude and reputation to the very house that once owned her. Freedom brought a new legal name that kept the patron's name inside it, like a watermark. Even independence announced whose permission made it possible. There were quieter ceremonies too, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The replacement of a household amulet. The adoption of a new festival as if it had always been celebrated. The first time a child born in this new life called her mother in a language she had been forced to learn. Small rites with large consequences, each one a stitch that fastened the old life shut. Rome congratulated itself on the gentleness of these processes. There was little blood, little screaming, but what they spared in spectacle they spent in permanence. A life could be bent slowly until straightening it would mean breaking it. Some women resisted in the only places Rome did not police, memory and meaning. They whispered old prayers under new ones, kept private calendars beside official ones, taught lullabies with hidden words folded inside Latin rhymes. Resistance did not undo the system, it smuggled the self through it. By the time the ceremonies finished, a conquered wife was no longer simply captive. She was documented, renamed, repurposed, and, cruelest of all, presented as safe. That was the brilliance of Roman ritual. It made domination feel like completion. When a system closes every door, survival begins with measuring cracks. Conquered women learned to count them. The first calculation was value, not self-worth, market. Worth. A woman who could make herself indispensable bought time and options. She became the person who knew the household accounts better than its master, who could calm a fever at midnight, who could manage a harvest without waste. Indispensability didn't equal safety, but it created a bargaining chip. Remove me, and your world stumbles. The second calculation was information. News moved through kitchens faster than couriers. Who was feuding with whom? Which official feared scandal? Which neighbour owed a favour? These facts could be arranged like tiles into a path. A warning delivered at the right moment might be cached later as a request. Better quarters, a promise about a child, a delay in a sale. Gossip, weaponized, became a savings account. Third came sponsorship. Within every Roman house, someone needed to be seen as virtuous. A mistress eager to perform mercy, a patron chasing a reputation for clemency, a son who liked to imagine himself fair. These were angles. Align with a powerful conscience, and you might borrow its light. Align too obviously, and you became a rival to the person it eclipsed. The strategy was to orbit without casting a shadow. Language was leverage. Latin opened rooms. Greek opened others. Knowing both turned a captive into a hinge that connected masters to merchants, officials to priests. Every sentence translated was a tiny negotiation. I carry your meaning. You carry my request. The art was to phrase the ask as an inevitable conclusion of the favour just performed. Children altered the equation again. A mother could become the engine of an entire estate, organising, teaching, smoothing, if her child tied her usefulness to the house's future. But motherhood also exposed the nerve Rome most liked to press. Women learned to trade on timing. Put your request forward when your child's value to the household is highest, when the boy's tutor praises him in front of guests, when the girl's skills impress a visiting patron. Ask for a promised manumission date. Ask for a guarantee against sale. Ask for something that can be written down. Documentation, once a weapon, could be repurposed as armour. A bill of sale that listed skills. A note of commendation from a governor's wife. A manumission draft drawn up but not yet signed. Papers could be stacked like stones to make a low wall. In a world that worshipped procedure, proof became prayer. Some women cultivated scarcity, refused to be everywhere, learned to be precisely where you matter most. If only you can coax the infant sleep, only you can reconcile the monthly accounts, only you can negotiate with the linen supplier who trusts no one else. Your absence begins to carry a price. Price invites negotiation. Others learned the calendar. Mercy seasons existed, birthdays of patrons, festivals that rewarded generosity, the days before elections when a man's image mattered more than his impulse. A petition made on the wrong day was an annoyance. The same petition, on the right day, looked like an opportunity for someone to be praised. There were hard lines. Some masters closed every avenue. Some houses replaced cleverness with pure fear. Here, survival meant invisibility. Speak little, learn everything. Leave no trace except competence. The aim was to outlast. Empires rotate personnel. Heirs inherit them with them new priorities. If you cannot move the wall, wait for a new door. Collective strategies existed too, whispered through back rooms. Women shared recipes and remedies, but also scripts. What to say when questioned by an official. How to hide a token of the old life. How to convert a slap into a scolding by avoiding the man who wanted the spectacle. They taught one another how to read a face and how to read a room. The curriculum was survival. None of this redeemed the system. It revealed its seams. Rome liked to pretend its rules were iron. Women learned they were fabric, tightly woven, hard to tear, but thread by thread, subject to patience. Sometimes the math added up to freedom. A loyal decade, a child who rose, a patron's vanity satisfied, papers signed, witnesses gathered, a new name spoken aloud. Freedom did not erase the past, but it created a ledger entry the woman could finally claim as hers. She carried it like a key, knowing how many locked doors lay behind her. And sometimes the math failed. The sale overwritten a promise, a death that reset the household, a rumour that broke a fragile patronage. Even then the arithmetic did not stop. To live was to calculate anew. No empire breathes without resistance. Even inside Rome's tidy machinery there were ruptures, brief blinding flashes when a woman refused the script and forced everyone to see the stage. Rebellion began in whispers and ended in ledgers. A key gone missing, a child smuggled to a sympathetic priest, a forged travel pass that looked official enough in the dusk. Sometimes it was louder. A storeroom set alight, a mistress confronted in a moment of terrible clarity, a sprint across a courtyard when a gate stood open 2 heartbeats too long. None of it was random. Rebellion cost more than fear, it cost calculation. You risked your life and someone else's safety because the math of staying had turned to zero. Flight had routes the maps didn't show, temple precincts that frowned on dragging fugitives past their altars, workshop guilds that turned curious when a stranger asked about a woman who balanced their books, back rooms of taverns where foreign tongues were common and questions were not. The sea was both hope and trap. One ship's captain would sell you back for a finder's fee, another, out of greed or pity, would hide you in the ballast and call it luck if you reached the next coast alive. Rome's response avoided spectacle until it needed it. Quiet punishments did most of the work. A sail north far from familiar faces, a child reassigned as compensation for losses, a demotion from house to field, from ink and keys to mud and silence. Paper moved the body. Rumour moved the fear. When Rome wanted memory to do the punishing, it staged a scene. A recaptured woman paraded through a market and returned to her owner's door, not beaten to death, but marked. Hair cut, clothing ripped. A placard hung around her neck naming the offence. The message was civic. The city protects its contracts. The lesson was personal. Your body is a bulletin board. In the worst cases, execution wrote the full stop. Not the public horrors reserved for treason, but something measured. A sentence read, a corner chosen, a burial quiet enough to deny a martyr and firm enough to build a warning. If the rebellion had been collective, a ring of women coordinating flights, a household conspiracy that humiliated a patron, Rome added fines, audits, inspections. The law arrived wearing clean sandals and left footprints on everyone. And yet, through every punishment, someone witnessed a crack. A chamberlain who looked away at the right moment, a clerk who stamped a paper twice, a guard who remembered a sister and loosened his grip for one step. Empires rely on systems. Escapes rely on human beings. Stories of defiance travelled like contraband scripture. A woman who took a beating to protect a child. Another who swallowed her terror and negotiated terms at the peak of a patron's vulnerability. then held him to the letter of his promise. A third who disappeared between estates and reappeared years later as a midwife with a different name, gathering around her a small congregation of the saved. Rome could not prosecute a rumour. The deeper truth sat between fear and hope. Punishment worked because most people loved someone they could not bear to endanger. Resistance worked because some loved someone they could not bear to leave behind. Between those two gravities, choices were made that history rarely writes down. Wars end on calendars. Their consequences do not. Rome's treatment of enemies' wives recalibrated entire populations, and the ripples moved farther than any legion could march. First, the numbers changed. In regions folded into the empire, women disappeared from village rosters without graves to explain them. Birth patterns shifted. Marriages happened later or not at all. Cousin lines thinned and ended. A community missing its women is a house missing its beams. Everything can look upright until the storm arrives. Labour patterns walked next. Textile work, midwifery, market exchange, tasks that women anchored, had to be learned anew by those left behind, or they withered. Men crossed hills for work that used to be done at home. Grandmothers bore loads meant for daughters who never returned. A village could keep its fields and still lose its future. Then memory adapted, because memory always does. Songs trimmed names that hurt to sing. Feasts shifted dates to avoid anniversaries that bled. Stories hardened into parables. Beware the treaty, beware the oath, beware the smile on a conqueror's face. Rome called this superstition. Families called it instruction. The empire's own bloodstream changed as well. Children born of captive mothers grew up with two maps in their heads, the official one of provinces and prefectures, and the private one of mothers' stories told in kitchens at low volume. Some wanted to forget, others could not. The result was not rebellion on every street, it was something subtler and more durable, a habit of seeing the law from the outside, even while obeying it. Centuries later, when northern raiders tore at coasts and chronicles gasped at the terror, much of Europe already knew the script. Markets had long ago learned how to price a person. Courts already knew how to write possession as if it were virtue. The Vikings lit a fire Rome had built the hearth for. The shock felt familiar because Rome had normalized the premise that the fate of women could be a lever for politics, profit, and peace. Even genetics kept the minutes. Lines braided across borders that once swore never to recognize each other. A family tree that should have branched under one sky spread like ivy over a wall and reached sunlight on the other side. The past stayed present in faces. What survived most stubbornly was the grammar of power. Bureaucracy outlived the Caesars who loved it. The idea that domination should look like a document, that mercy should look like a stamp, that erasure should look like a new name, these habits endured wherever Rome taught them. Long after the legions withdrew, the paperwork kept marching. Which is why this story matters beyond sorrow. To understand Rome's policies toward the wives of their enemies is to read the preface to later empires, and to modern systems that still prefer signatures to screams. When you can hear the echo, you know what made the sound. Not every story ended at the auction block or the household door. Rome built exits, narrow, toll-gated, treacherous, and some women walked them until their feet bled and the gates swung open. Manumission was the most visible door. Freedom could arrive by magistrate's rod, by a line in a will, by a patron's public performance of virtue. It always arrived witnessed, counted, taxed, and renamed. A freedwoman stepped out carrying a brand new identity that still held her patron's name inside it like a signature in the corner of a painting. She was free to contract, to marry, to earn. She was not free from gratitude. In Rome, gratitude had clauses. Some carved space with contracts. A concubine who had run a household for years could press for a written promise. If a son reached adulthood, she would be freed. If a dowry was provided for a daughter, she would not be sold. The paper did not guarantee obedience from a master, but it gave allies in the city a reason to intervene when promises frayed. When the system reveres documents, even the powerless can learn to weaponize ink. Others leveraged piety. A matron seeking a reputation for clemency might free a faithful attendant at her funeral, knowing the gesture would adorn her epitaph. Women learned to live in that shadow, serving with just enough brilliance that denying their freedom would look like meanness, granting it like inevitability. Reputation opened purses. It could open doors. A few used money. A skilled midwife, a textile manager with a cut of the profits, a translator with loyal clients. These women saved, quietly, over years. They purchased their freedom, or their children's. Sometimes they bought the freedom of a friend and created a partnership. Two freed women pooling capital to open a workshop, to rent a stall, to step out of back rooms into the marketplace with their names on a tablet above the door. Identity repair took other forms. A freed woman sponsored an altar in the name of the mother Rome refused to remember. Another commissioned a funerary stone that told the old story in cautious code, a birthplace far away, a father's name that wasn't Roman, a hint that the first marriage happened before the empire rewrote the book. In a world that prized brevity on stone, the choice to spend precious letters on the past was an act of defiance. Marriages after freedom could reset the ledger. Some wed former patrons and formalized the life they already lived, gaining inheritance rights and legal standing for their children. Others married men of their choosing, freedmen, citizens, soldiers after discharge, and built households that ran on consent instead of command. Even then, the past hovered. A patron retained certain claims on a freed woman's loyalty, and society never quite forgot who had signed her first. Religion shifted the terrain in later centuries. New teachings about souls and dignity slipped under old laws and pried at them. Converts found communities that spoke of equality before a single god, then walked back into cities that priced people. The contradiction did not dissolve the system, but it armed some women with words, allies, and a different audience for their petitions. A bishop's letter could do what a ledger would not. Children were the most forceful editors of fate. A son who rose through trade or service could reverse a family's slope, purchasing his mother's freedom, or inscribing her name in places where it could not be ignored. A daughter who learned letters could keep records that outlived rumour and made claims that stuck. The empire trained children to be Roman. Some grew up and used Rome to repay a debt the law never acknowledged. There were returns too, rare and jagged. A woman who crossed the line of post-liminium and stepped back into the city of her birth did not find the old house waiting. She found a place that had rehearsed her absence until it felt like fact. Return demanded its own courage, to ask for recognition, to argue that marriage suspended by war should breathe again, to claim a dowry once marked absorbed. Sometimes the city relented, sometimes it offered pity instead of justice. Even then, the attempt compelled a record. Paper, once the instrument of erasure, became a witness that the erasure had been challenged. Not every ending is triumph. Many were quiet survivals, a small shop, a second marriage, a grave with a real name on it. But the fact of an ending the woman chose, that mattered. It placed one decision in a life ringed by orders. It insisted that if history would not grant back what was taken, it would at least be made to say her name. Before the longships there were legions. That's where we began and that's where we end, with the recognition that Rome didn't merely precede Viking terror, it authored the template that made it legible. Rome taught conquest to wear a laurel and carry a ledger. It showed the world how to turn a wife into a paragraph, a home into a contract, a life into a receipt. It made captivity look like order and called erasure peace. The Vikings were loud, Rome was thorough, and thorough is harder to kill. What Rome did to the wives of its enemies was not a single atrocity but a system: capta, tutela, obsidies, concubina, manumissio. Each term a door that opened only one way. It dissolved marriages without knives, conquered households without torches, and purchased loyalty with the bodies and futures of women who did not sign the treaties that bound them. Centuries later, Other empires would copy the handwriting and pretend they had invented it. But endings matter, and so does what we do with them. The record shows women who calculated, negotiated, endured, escaped, freed others, wrote their names back into stone, and raised children who refused to forget. Their victories were modest compared to the size of the machine that ground around them. Modest does not mean small. A life reclaimed is a history corrected. So we return to the opening question. When the legions marched away, what did Rome do to the wives of their enemies? And why did it work so well? It worked because it was designed to be invisible, to live in documents rather than screams, to pass as normal. And the remedy for a violence that hides in normal is to name it where it lives, in our laws, our ledgers, our rituals that pretend to be neutral. Remember this when you hear the tidy phrase, order restored. Ask who paid for the order and with what. When you encounter a bureaucratic mercy, a stamp, a form, a procedure, ask whose freedom it measures and whose silence it requires. If Rome still breathes anywhere, it breathes in the places where signatures make cruelty polite. The wives Rome took were not footnotes to victory. They were the very pages it wrote on. Some were lost, some were found. All of them deserve to be read as people, not precedents. If this history unsettled you, let it. Let it sharpen your hearing for echoes in the present. And if you carry a name someone else gave you, or a story someone else tried to write over, take this as permission to speak your own aloud. You've heard the legend of Northern raiders. Now you know the prologue Rome wrote for them.